Highland Copper Company Inc. It trades on the OTCQB under the symbol HDRSF and on the TSXV under the symbol HI. It is a Canadian company focused on exploring and developing copper projects in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the United States. Please welcome its CEO, Barry O'Shea. Welcome to the conference, Barry.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate the introduction, and it's exciting to introduce Highland Copper to all of your investors today. As a starting point, let me just give you a little framework here. So obviously, Highland Copper has two projects. It has the Copperwood project in Michigan. It also has a joint venture interest in the neighboring White Pine project. So two projects that are really nicely sequenced in a pretty wonderful historic mining district. And I think what's nice about today and early into this year, 2025, we're seeing a real inflection point for copper assets in the U.S. The U.S. has declared an energy emergency. I think, as most will know, copper price is certainly moving in the right direction, and the importance of U.S. resource independence is really intensifying, certainly under a Trump administration. So, I'd encourage you to take a look at our assets. I think there are very few that are fully permitted in the U.S. Ours is certainly one of them. And those are the three key points that I actually want you to take away. Number one, Highland Copper has Copperwood, which is one of very few fully permitted projects in the U.S., certainly held by an intermediate group of our scale. Again, amongst its peer group, I'd say the most highly leveraged relative to copper price. And something that I'll point out is just the strength of the region that we operate in Michigan. Very few jurisdictions, both permitting and looking to incentivize mining. So really what this gives rise to is, a copper project that has real optionality, not just in terms of the asset value as copper price moves, but also in terms of your price to net asset value multiples as you move from being a explorer developer into a cash flowing producer. So a real opportunity, certainly when you look at the context of valuations these days, not just for Highland, but certainly our asset class as copper developers. And maybe I'll just start briefly with some of the headlines. And I think you'll have seen many of these. Listen, there's a scarcity of copper worldwide. When you look at that supply-demand imbalance specific to the U.S., it only increases further. And historically, that supply-demand imbalance would be met by imports. But we all know that the world has quite dramatically changed geopolitically. And that means you can no longer rely on imports. And that speaks to the importance of domestic copper in the U.S. And I think the relevance of that is, when an investor looks at investing in mining, copper mining, a starting point is something of a binary call that an investor needs to make. Can the project actually be built? In the U.S. At this point in time, we certainly believe this project can be. And it's because of these key building blocks. Listen, the U.S. is a great jurisdiction. I'll speak in a little more detail to our local support in Michigan. Permits at the end of the day are your most key and fundamental building block when you're thinking about that binary concept as to whether or not a mine can be built. We have our permits in hand, and resource scale across our two projects, multi-billion copper pound resources, giving rise to these long-lived assets, set to generate cash for a meaningful period of time. But let me speak first of all to Michigan. As I say, there are very few jurisdictions, and I mean this worldwide, not just in the U.S., that are both permitting projects in a prescriptive manner, but also considering incentivizing projects. We're currently in a process under consideration for a $50 million grant to assist with the infrastructure of the project. We sit in private land in Michigan. That's quite relevant, naturally thinking about the permitting process. Although I will say it's looking as though the federal permitting will become easier as time goes on. We can supply directly into Michigan industry and OEMs. And very important, this is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, this east-west copper belt mined for well over 100 years through to the late 1990s. We're looking to bring it back to the region. There's incredible nostalgia and community support, and I think you'll understand that that's very important, specifically as you think to license to operate and capacity to build. So now let's just take a quick look at the two assets. Again, I said resource scale is really important. Sometimes when people think of Highland Copper, they think of our projects as relatively small, but I think that's not necessarily the case. Copperwood has 3.7 billion pounds of copper defined. You can see as 54 million tons at a really nice 1.5% grade. That gives rise to our first 11-year mine life, 30,000 tons per year copper. That's nearly 70 million pounds of copper. So a really nice project with a good capital intensity of a scale that a company like ours can build. Really wonderfully sequenced is our joint venture White Pine project. Again, larger again, 5.4 billion pounds, acknowledging we own 1/3 of that, giving rise to a 22-year mine life done at a PEA level, 42,000, so nearly 90 million pounds of copper annually. So two really nice projects, one of which we're driving forward, and the other alongside our partner, Kinterra, really advancing both to production as well as feasibility study on our second project. Like I mentioned, permits at the end of the day are key. These are the 7 state permits required to operate in Michigan. We have them all in hand. And with White Pine being a past producer, we're grandfathered in terms of permitting to some degree. But this is one of the main stories that I want you to take away here. It's the leverage to copper price. You know, certainly at this point in time, copper developers such as us are sitting relatively modestly valued, certainly today. But this leverage to asset value, I think, is a real key. If you take a look at the $4 copper price at which we did our feasibility study for Copperwood, it's a respectable 170 million NPV and an 18% IRR. But if you increase copper price to $5, so a 25% increase, it gives rise to a 300% increase in net asset value to 507 million. And even looking at White Pine, just on our 34% stake, it's a very similar story. At $5 copper, a 525 million net asset value. And I talk again about sequencing. You know, the nice thing, both from a timing perspective, but also a workload perspective, these projects are well set up. We sold 2/3 of White Pine about 18 months ago, and what that allowed us to do is focus really all of our time and attention on our 100% owned, fully permitted Copperwood project, while our new partner, Kinterra, is putting their time, money, and energy into White Pine, and that's worked particularly well as we look to surface this value. Now let me take just a quick step back, and I'll start with the Copperwood project just to give you a little more context. I think it's really important to acknowledge the responsible project design. We're operating in a beautiful area of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and so it's critically important to be respectful of the environment that we're in. It's an underground mine, so naturally a modest footprint. We're specifically electing not to draw water from Lake Superior. We're protecting and creating new wetland to offset some of the impacts that we have done. So broadly speaking, you can begin to understand why we've managed to get key support from all local communities. As a matter of fact, when we went into our grant process, we were able to supply the state of Michigan government 22 full unanimous resolutions of support from all local counties, municipalities, and townships. Really important. And you can also understand, naturally, it's important to them given the scale of jobs and economic boost to the region. I mentioned the leverage to copper price. This shows it just in a little more detail. And listen, copper price has moved very much in the right direction through 2025, and I think we understand the macro reasons why. Even at 450, the net asset value has moved from 170 million to a near 340 million. And as you move towards that $5, you continue to see the ongoing impact. But at the end of the day, copper price can't be the only thing that drives the project. Obviously, there's the multi-billion-pound asset value. But when you look at our life of mine, we have the capacity also to extend that initial 11-year mine life. I mentioned an initial 54 million tons that we used for that mine life. But on top of that, there's 79 million inferred tons, reflecting that we do believe this will be a 15 to 20-year mine life. And there are other technical optimizations that we're specifically looking to work toward. And I think specifically ultrafine flotation technology is a key one. We're looking to do that predominantly to think about a smaller footprint of our plant, but also to look at the grade recovery curve amongst a host of other optimizations that we're going to look to move on. And so how do we unlock that value? Well, it's through execution. Through 2024, we've impacted the ground. So we started to set up the water management structure to shield off the areas that will be the future infrastructure, and also begin to create some of the compensating wetland in compensation for some of the wetland that we have impacted. You know, what the nice, I say, byproducts for this has been that we've established a nice operating presence in the region. started to work with local unions and contractors, and of course demonstrated our environmental stewardship, a really good starting point. Other key accomplishments, obviously moving the grant in the right direction through the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, the Michigan Strategic Fund, and also approved at the House legislative level, acknowledging we're now attempting to work it through the Senate. I mentioned working with the unions in Michigan. Very fortunate to have such a strong workforce readily available and ready to get to work. We've signed a letter of intent to have a project labor agreement and look forward to that really productive working relationship. And naturally, as you think about developing your project, you need to have your right team in place. And I think most specifically, I'd note that we hired about 5 months ago now a very high-end project director, Vinan Van Dyke, and he's stepping us now into engineering. And so when you think about moving forward, of course, now it's that piece. Having a feasibility study done is great, but your next big step to prepare yourself for project financing and a construction decision, of course, is detailed engineering. We announced about 3 weeks ago that we've signed on with DRA Global, a very well-reputed engineering firm, and we're already stepping into our phase 1 of engineering to prepare ourselves to move the project forward. And with that, we're also looking at optimizations. So again, about 3 weeks ago, we announced that we're stepping into a drill program, predominantly to get metallurgical samples as we look at this ultrafine flotation technology. You'll understand, obviously, there are some key drivers from your resource to copper price in terms of the economics of the project, but the grade recovery curve is one of the most important ones as well. And we're looking to improve that as we consider ultrafine flotation technology. And naturally, we never take for granted our community engagement. Maintaining license to operate regional is of the utmost importance, and we'll continue to do that. So broadly speaking, with the right team in place, engineers in place, drills turning at site, we're driving the project to a construction decision on a truly optimized project design, and we look forward to moving that on. And now just taking a look at White Pine, I mentioned obviously Copperwood is our 100% owned project that we have full hands on. We're working alongside our joint venture partner, Kinterra, on White Pine. And if you take a look here, you can understand why it was valuable to them when they purchased 2/3 of it just over 18 months ago. 821 million NPV. This is on a 100% basis. Again, a nice capital intensity and a reasonable operating cost per pound. So a really nice project. And I think of note, it's a past producer. So probably the most interesting piece that you see on here, of course, is that there's power, rail, and roads still coming into sight, and a very important piece of infrastructure in terms of the North Tailings bin that will allow us simply to lift and continue to place tails there over the remainder of the life of mine. Really important as you think about a brownfield operation having less impact in terms of a new construction. And so again, while we're getting Copperwood ready for a true construction decision through 2025, Kinterra is arguably only 2 to 3 years behind. In 2024, they did a significant drill program to collect the metallurgical and geotechnical samples to prepare themselves for feasibility and pre-feasibility engineering studies. They did a huge amount of the environmental baselining. Again, the key point there is that gives you the information available to prepare your permit applications as we step into the balance of the year. And of course, working through engineering trade-offs. So again, in this example, they're driving to permitting and pre-feasibility study, nicely sequencing this project, only 2 to 3 years behind Copperwood. We certainly believe we're going to get rewarded as we advance these projects to true construction-ready assets. And let me wrap up with a few pieces of key investor information. Any company like ours needs some key and strong shareholders in the background, and we've been fortunate to have some very loyal ones over the past number of years as we've advanced these projects, and most specifically Orion Mine Finance that own 28% of our company. Very valuable from that perspective. 2 brokers covering us now, and we certainly look to continue to establish that to a greater degree as we step towards production. So just a quick wrap then on some of the key achievements. Having the 2 projects updated studies through 2023 and into early 2024, finished the Copperwood feasibility study, we finished the White Pine PEA, and in combination with that, did a joint venture on the White Pine asset. That really, as I mentioned, unlocked our capacity to move the 2 projects forward, both from a management time perspective, as well as a capital perspective. Great progress in 2024 on Copperwood, completing the site work, keeping our permits, very importantly, in good standing, putting a project director in place, and really initiating some of that bid work. But that sets us up with some key catalysts as we move into the balance of 2025. And if we start with Copperwood, obviously, as I mentioned, the engineering is the most important piece. As we advance ourselves into that 35 to 40% engineered range, I think you'll understand the relevance of that is that it prepares you for a project finance, really, and allows you to step into due diligence and allow yourself to make a construction decision on an optimized project. Of course, I mentioned that we're currently working through a drill program. Look forward to completing that in the near term, and that allows us to step into net testing for ultrafine flotation technology. Naturally, we're hoping that will allow us to optimize the project, improving the project, of course, both from a copper price perspective, but in terms of the technical ways that we can also manage it. Plenty of catalysts also at White Pine. We're looking for a resource update through the first half of 2025. Kintyre will continue that environmental baselining process. So as you look to the tail end of 2025 or into early 2026, looking at submitting permitting applications and, of course, the initiation of a pre-feasibility study. From a corporate perspective, of course, we continue to work very hard through the state grant process. If you look at our market cap today, it's about a 40 to 50 million US. So the boost of a $50 million grant would naturally be very meaningful to us, specifically as we think about initiating a project financing. There are other things that we can also be doing in terms of potential industry partnerships as we start early discussions with the likes of Ford, GM, and other regional auto part makers to really ensure that we're looking at this from a supply side perspective. Naturally, you can understand that Michigan copper being put into Michigan cars would be a wonderful story from our perspective. And so let me just wrap it up then, talking about the big picture. You take a look at this region here. This is a wonderful historic mining district, but we're looking at being the first entrance back in. Of course, starting with Copperwood as a wonderful mid-sized producer, stepping from there into White Pine alongside our partner. You may also have seen that Talon is active in the region, and Lundin Mining on the other side of the Upper Peninsula, still operating the Eagle Mine. So there's a real place for a regional consolidation that we're going to look to work through here. As you work towards being a producer and taking those cash flows on, naturally, there's a re-rate that can we look towards. And if you think specific to the changes in copper price, of course, there's extreme leverage from an asset value perspective. And the last piece just that I wanted to point out was just this alignment with the critical mineral strategy in the U.S. I think I mentioned at the outset that we're looking at a real inflection point here that allows assets, as I say, not just Copperwood and White Pine, but other U.S. Copper assets, lithium assets, and others that support the energy transition, defense, and otherwise being highlighted, and you're starting to see that. We look very much forward to these two projects feeding into that transition, to being part of the U.S. supply at this much needed point in time. And from an investment perspective, I guess the last thing I would say is that, when you look at copper companies, there are actually only a handful, certainly permitted, ready to take advantage of this copper cycle. One interesting fact, when you look at copper mining, and truthfully, this is mining generally, it takes 15 to 20 years from initial discovery through to development to production. We're certainly at the 15 to 20 year mark ourselves. So we're very well placed as we step into what we think will be a wonderful copper cycle. Certainly encourage you to take a look at our projects. As I mentioned, the fundamental building blocks are key when you look at assets that are arguably undervalued. Very happy to take any one-on-one meetings as and when they come. And with that, Anna, more than happy to pass back to you and take any questions if there are.
Perfect. Thank you, Barry. Okay, yes. Let's talk a little bit about an update on the status of the 50 million grant. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, as a starting point, I think we've had great success through 2024 and into this year. Michigan Economic Development proposed the grant. It's an infrastructure grant to bring power, road, and telecommunications to the region. So naturally a benefit to the region, but also, of course, to our project. The Michigan Strategic Fund is the first level of civil service. They approved it unanimously in early 2024, and then it went through the House at the legislative level. I will acknowledge now we are at the final step. It's the Senate Appropriations Committee. And it's been interesting as we've gone from one step to the next. There's been different questions and different challenges. I think we've been successful to date, but indeed we're certainly having to be patient to walk the Senate through all the merits, and we think there are many. Not to mention obviously the infrastructure components, the job components. But I think what's most important from my perspective is that we're trying to help the Senate understand that those economic benefits that come to the region certainly don't need to be at the expense of environmental protections. And I think we demonstrated that through our project design.
Thank you for that. And can you please also describe the structure of project financing when a construction decision is made?
Yeah, so if you look at our company, if we come to the tail end of this year, we think we'll be appropriately engineered, meaning we have sufficient engineering done to support due diligence, which I think you'll understand both from a debt and equity perspective can be very challenging. So we're needing to get the project designed well and engineered well through this year. As and when we have that in place, we'll also have learned in that time whether or not we've been successful on the $50 million grant. Of course, that would be a wonderful first step, thinking about the broader $400 million required to build the overall project. The second piece would be the debt. And we'd run a pretty robust process. We've done our debt capacity calculations and certainly think that the project can support, at $4 copper and arguably more at a higher price, but 150 to 200 million from a debt perspective. That can be done responsibly as we think about it. And then as you think about the balance, then there are certain things like asset financing, offtake financing, but certainly an equity component as we think about filling in the overall 400 million financing.
And talk about the outlook for 2025 in terms of project development.
Yeah, so listen, I think I've helped you understand obviously that Copperwood is a project that is ready for construction. So really it's getting through the engineering through this year, finding ourselves at the tail end arguably where we understand better where copper price is at, certainly where we stand from the state grant, and the likelihood that we have the capital markets in place to raise that capital. We certainly think this year is the exact right year. I mentioned we're at an inflection point from a number of perspectives, copper price being one of them. We'll also know whether or not we've been able to improve the project, putting aside copper price. So with all those pieces in place, we'll look to make a construction decision alongside a knowledge that our construction financing can be put in place. If we do all of that, it puts us in the position to initiate construction in 2026. I'll tell you, it's about a 2.5-year construction window, so that gives you a sense of the timeline to production in that example.
Oh, we have a question from Jordan. If you can go back over some details of your fully permitted property, can you say the name of it and describe the infrastructure around it, water, roads, power, et cetera?
Yeah, so it's the Copperwood project, and I'll acknowledge it's a greenfield project. You can see it on the map there on the southern side of Lake Superior. There are multiple towns along a highway relatively close to the project, so there is good infrastructure, certainly from a housing town perspective, but there isn't power brought directly to site. So that's something that we'll need to do as part of that process. That state grant that we're talking about arguably is predominantly for power and roads. There is a road that goes right by the mine. It's County Road 519, but I think the relevance there, again, as we think about infrastructure, is that it needs to be converted to an all-season road, naturally, as a mining project. There's the nice byproduct that it gives access into that particular area broadly also. So, there's good infrastructure in the region, but naturally it needs to be brought to the front door of the mine.
And Alan wants to know, in which industries do you see the largest demand for copper?
Well, I always, there's a whole host of arguably new demand sectors. As a starting point, I go back to just, development, urbanization, certainly looking at China. They account for about 50% of global use. So I think irrespective of new areas of demand, that is a key piece as you look at copper price and what moves it. But there are other things, I'll give you an example. When you look at an electric vehicle or alternative sources of power, they use copper a factor of 5 times to that of their conventional counterparts. When you're also looking at things in the U.S., again, they're talking about AI and many billions of dollars being put into the infrastructure for AI. Data centers are also driven very heavily by copper. So there are a whole range of reasons to understand why there is a 3-to-1 supply-demand imbalance projected in the U.S. By the year 2035, and of course, with less access to imports, the domestic production from projects like ours are becoming increasingly important.
And with that said, Jason asks about copper's rise in price since 2020, up nearly 500%. Do you think that'll continue?
Yeah, to be quite honest, I do. I think we're only at the beginning here. I mean, interestingly, over the last 2 to 3 years, and we saw it jump up past $5 a pound 18 months or so ago, but it's actually been somewhat sideways, sitting in that $4 to $4.50 range for a few years now. And all the while, the supply-demand imbalance is only, I would say, extending. Very few mines have been built in that intervening period, so the supply side is weakening. We're seeing other areas of demand from a copper perspective. The fundamentals have been in place for some time. To be quite honest, as we as a company, and certainly I'd say copper investors, have had to be patient to see the copper cycle play out. I think we're starting to see it move in 2025.
And Chris wants to know your thoughts on how you think copper will hedge against inflation versus gold.
Yeah, I mean, listen, copper is often not necessarily seen, I would say, as a hedge against inflation. It's often movement in copper can be seen as something that moves hand in hand with inflation. I certainly think we've seen inflation hold off to some degree, so I think that copper is certainly going to very much outpace inflation, but I wouldn't see it as a measure against it.
And you mentioned this earlier, but touch on it again, please. Frank asks about the current administration. Are there any grants you can grab?
Yeah, so obviously we're quite focused on the state of Michigan. We operate on private land in Michigan. Grants available there are in and around infrastructure predominantly. So that's where we're focused. There are grants at a federal level, at the Department of Energy in particular, as you think about copper. So we are looking at those. We don't have full clarity on the process that we're running there, but certainly giving some consideration to that.
And Aman asks specifically with copperwood and white pine, are you developing and producing the metals yourself, or are you looking for a partner?
So I think for any company like us, we have to have a plan, an organic plan to build these projects ourselves. I think we're fortunate in that copperwood has a manageable capital intensity and a manageable initial capital at $400 million. We believe we have the team in place. So listen, we're looking to build this project ourselves. That doesn't mean we won't take investment at the right time along the way. And naturally, as you progress a project meaningfully through that cycle, if there are interested buyers, again, as management, it's our obligation always to consider those. So we'll bear that in mind. I think the strongest thing that we did from a capital perspective was to sell 2/3 and to joint venture our second project, White Pine. The two projects together, fully under our ownership, certainly had limiting capacity in terms of our ability, specifically financially. So alongside Kinterra, I think the project is well taken care of, both from a time perspective, but also a capital perspective. As I say, we're looking to build this project, build this region as a company.
Wonderful. Well, Barry, do you have any closing remarks for our viewers today?
No, listen, very excited. This is the first time I've been at one of these conferences. So yeah, it's just always nice to speak to new investors. I think these projects in this region somewhat sit a bit overlooked. Not everybody's familiar with them, but there's a time and a place for every asset. I think for copperwood and white pine, we're in the right time and place, both from a U.S. perspective, a copper price perspective, and I think our share price is going to do very well over the coming period.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us on our conference, and we'd love to have you back with some more updates in the future.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, stay with us. We'll be right back.